Before we start, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. James Donovan stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 43rd floor office and watched New York move below him with the indifferent efficiency of a machine that doesn't know it's being observed. Taxis cutting each other off. Pedestrians threading gaps in the crowd. The whole city operating at a pace that suggested it had somewhere important to be and always had. He had built 3 of the tallest buildings visible from where he stood. He owned companies on 4 continents. His name appeared in publications that track the accumulation of wealth the way other publications track the weather, because to a certain kind of reader, both were equally relevant to how the day was going to go. And standing here at 7 in the evening, with a city's worth of ambition laid out below him, James Donovan felt profoundly, specifically, and almost impressively empty. He had felt this way for a while. He had simply been too busy to give it his full attention. The problem, and he had identified it with the same methodical clarity he brought to quarterly reviews, was not the work. The work was fine. The work was, in fact, excellent. The problem was everything that existed around the work, which was to say, the people, more precisely, the particular category of person who found their way into his orbit and remained there. Women who smiled at the right moments and mentioned his developments casually in conversation, as though they'd simply happened to read about them. Colleagues who agreed with his assessments before he'd finished making them. Friends, and he used the word with increasing reservation, who surfaced reliably when something was being celebrated and were less consistent when something wasn't. He had, 3 weeks earlier, ended a relationship with a woman who was by any reasonable measure extraordinary, intelligent, accomplished, genuinely kind in many directions, who had nonetheless, at a dinner with mutual acquaintances, referenced his portfolio in a way that made him understand she thought of it as partially hers. She hadn't said anything wrong, precisely. It was more the ease of the assumption, the comfort with which she had already made herself at home in something he'd built alone. He'd been civil about it. He was always civil. Afterward, standing in his apartment at midnight with a glass of something expensive he didn't want, he had thought, I have no idea if anyone in my life is here for me or for what I represent. And the frightening thing wasn't that the answer might be nobody. The frightening thing was that he genuinely couldn't tell. It was this thought, turning over for 3 weeks with the persistence of something that refuses to be filed away, that produced the plan. He would disappear. Not permanently, not recklessly. He was not a reckless man. He had a board, a trusted legal team, contracts that would keep the machinery running without him. He would secure his absence with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. And he would go somewhere that didn't know his name, and he would find out whether he was someone worth knowing. It took him 4 weeks to organize everything. He told no one the full truth of where he was going or why. His team was told he needed a sabbatical, a word he'd never previously used, which caused his assistant Clara to look at him with a particular concern of someone checking a person's forehead for temperature. He chose a small coastal town in Maine, the kind of place that appeared on certain hand-drawn maps, and had exactly one cafe that was not a chain, and where the most significant annual event was a lobster festival that the locals discussed with the specific enthusiasm of people who have decided their town's character is worth defending. He drove there himself, which was already unusual. He arrived on a Tuesday in early October with 2 bags, a name that was half true, James Carter, which kept the James and discarded everything that came with Donovan, and the particular sensation of someone stepping off a very high ledge and hoping the parachute is in the bag. The cafe was called Harbor Morning, which told him everything he needed to know about the town's relationship with irony, and the owner, a compact woman in her 60s named hired him with the speed of someone who had been short-staffed since August and was not going to ask too many questions about a man who showed up looking capable and willing. Can you carry 3 plates at once without concentrating on it? She asked. I'll learn, he said. Close enough, she said. His apartment was above a hardware store and smelled of wood shavings and something warm he eventually identified as the hardware store owner's wife baking on Sundays. The furniture had been purchased at various points across several decades and had achieved, through the accident of accumulation, a kind of shabby coherence. There was one window that looked at the harbor. He spent the first morning sitting at it drinking coffee he had made himself in a kitchen the size of his Manhattan bathroom, and felt something he spent a while identifying. It was quiet, not the absence of sound. The harbor was not quiet, but the absence of demand. Nothing was waiting for his decision. Nothing required him to be James Donovan. He sat at the window for an hour and a half, which was the longest he had sat still without a purpose in 11 years. Grace Calloway came into Harbor Morning on a rainy Wednesday morning in the third week of October, fighting with an umbrella that had surrendered most of its structural integrity to a previous storm and retained only the frame and the aspiration. She was not, James thought, watching from behind the counter, the kind of person who needed an entrance. She simply arrived the way weather arrives, in a way that reorganizes the room slightly without asking permission. She wore a green jacket over a flour-dusted apron, because she had clearly come directly from work without deciding to, and her hair was doing 3 separate things as a result of the umbrella situation. She ordered a coffee and a slice of the apple pie that Dot made on Tuesday evenings for Wednesday mornings, and she said thank you to James in the specific way of someone who means it rather than performing it, and she sat at the window table and looked at the rain with the expression of someone who has a list of things to do and is giving herself 5 minutes before starting them. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning, James learned her name because Dot used it, and learned that she owned the flower shop at the end of Harbor Street, and learned, from the way it said the words her mother's shop, that this was a weight Grace carried carefully and did not set down. On the 5th morning, Grace said to him, while he refilled her coffee, "You're not from here." "No," he said. "Maine, though." "Generally." "No." She looked at him with the assessment of someone who has decided a person is interesting and is deciding how interested to be. "You don't talk much about yourself." "I'm learning to talk more," he said. "I'm working on it." She smiled at that, a real one, brief and unguarded, and looked back at the rain. "Fair enough," she said. "Neither do I, usually." He thought about that exchange for the rest of the day. Within 2 weeks, a rhythm had established itself. Grace arrived each morning between 7:15 and 7:30, ordered the same coffee, varied the food depending on what it had made, and stayed between 12 and 20 minutes depending on what the day required. James learned to have her coffee ready at approximately 7:20, which she noticed on the 3rd day and did not comment on, which told him she had noticed and chosen not to make it into something, which told him something about how she navigated small kindnesses. He observed with the precision of a man accustomed to reading rooms, carrying several things at once and managing it through a combination of competence and the refusal to admit any of it was difficult. The flower shop was struggling. He'd gathered this from fragments, from the way she occasionally looked at her phone mid-conversation with an expression she quickly rearranged, from the specific quality of her tiredness on the mornings after she'd clearly been doing paperwork late. One morning, toward the end of October, he asked if he could see the shop. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "What? I used to help with a business," he said, which was technically accurate in the way that describing the ocean as a body of water is technically accurate. "I might be able to help." "It's a flower shop," Grace said. "Not exactly complicated. Most things that look simple are harder than they look," James said. "And most things that look hard are simpler than they seem." She looked at him for a moment. "That's either very wise or completely meaningless." "I genuinely don't know which," he said. She laughed, properly, the kind that surprises the person laughing, and said he could come by on Saturday if he had nothing better to do, which he didn't, which was the point. Calloway's Flowers occupied a narrow storefront with a green-painted door and a window display that Grace changed every week with the focused attention of someone who believes the window is having a conversation with the street. Inside, it smelled of stems and water and the particular green coolness of a room that lives with cut flowers, which James found unexpectedly pleasant. Grace gave him the tour in approximately 3 minutes, because that was how long it took to cover the space, and then stood at the counter with her arms folded and said, "So, what do you see?" James looked around properly. Not the way a customer looks, but the way a person looks when they're trying to understand how something works and what it needs. The shop was beautiful and slightly invisible. The window display was excellent and faced a street that people walked along rather than down, which meant they saw it at an angle. The social media presence, which Grace showed him on her phone with the expression of someone presenting evidence of their own inadequacy, was well-intentioned and inconsistent. The pricing was too modest, not because Grace undervalued her work, but because she'd been afraid that raising prices would lose her the customer she had, which was a calculation of someone operating from scarcity rather than confidence. He didn't say any of this immediately. He asked questions instead. She answered them with the directness of someone who has been managing alone long enough to drop the pretense of having everything figured out. They spent 3 hours in the shop that Saturday. At the end, Grace made tea on a small kettle on the back shelf, and they sat on 2 stools and talked about her mother, who had started the shop 20 years earlier with a market stall, and the specific stubbornness of a person who has decided to turn something they love into something that sustains them. She made it work through sheer refusal to accept that it wouldn't. Grace said, "I've been trying to do the same thing. I'm not sure I inherited the refusal in the same quantity." "I think you have more of it than you know," James said. She looked at him. "You've known me for 3 weeks. Some things are visible quickly," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked at her tea. "You're strange, James Carter." "I know. I mean that as a compliment." "I know that too." He walked home along the harbor that evening with the particular quality of tiredness that comes from a day spent doing something that mattered, and thought that he had not felt this specific kind of tired in a very long time. Not the exhaustion of pressure or the depletion of performance, but the good emptiness of having been genuinely useful to someone who needed it. He also thought, with the honesty of a quiet harbor walk, that he was falling in love with Grace Calloway, and that this was going to become a serious problem at some point because he had not told her a single true thing about who he actually was. November arrived and brought with it the particular quality of a coastal New England autumn, which is to say it was beautiful and cold, and the light did something in the late afternoon that made everything look like a painting someone had decided not to finish. Grace's shop filled with orders for Thanksgiving arrangements and wreaths, and the particular category of flowers people buy when they want to make someone feel that a season has been properly acknowledged. James spent his days off at the shop. He helped with orders, learned more about flowers than he had expected to find interesting, and discovered that he was genuinely terrible at ribbon work but had an unexpected talent for structural arrangement, the kind that required thinking about weight distribution and visual balance, which were not, he reflected, entirely different from the skills he used in other contexts. "You have a spatial brain," Grace told him, watching him construct a centerpiece for his 60th birthday. "So people have told me," he said, which was true, though the context had previously been architectural. She smiled and went back to the wreaths. What he had not told Grace, and what occupied an increasing amount of his mental energy, was everything. His actual name. The fact that he owned buildings she would recognize for photographs. The fact that the reason he could afford to work at a cafe on a cafe's wage without any apparent financial anxiety was that he had the kind of money that makes financial anxiety structurally impossible. He had constructed, in the first weeks, a vague and durable story. A man who had worked in business in the city, who had left for reasons he was reticent to discuss, who was taking time to figure out what came next. This story had the advantage of being close enough to the truth to be sustainable and far enough from it to protect him from being recognized for what he was. But the story was not the truth, and the truth was getting heavier. He could feel in the moments when Grace spoke about him to other people, to the regular customers who had absorbed him into the cafe's social ecology, and refer to him as someone who used to work in business, the way you'd refer to a teacher who used to work in law, or a chef who used to work in finance. A respectable detour. A person of ordinary scale who had made an ordinary choice and ended up here. He let her believe this, and every day he let her believe it. The cost of the eventual correction increased. The first serious disruption arrived in the form of Owen Marsh, a property developer from Boston who came to the town in mid-November to look at a parcel of coastal land that was being sold by an estate. Owen was a man James had met at 6 or 7 industry events over the years. Not a friend, not quite a competitor, occupying the specific category of person whose name you know and whose handshake you recognize. James was arranging tables at the cafe when Owen walked in. Owen scanned the room with the reflexive assessment of a man who evaluates spaces professionally, and his eyes found James the way recognition finds a face it knows even when it doesn't expect to, with a small delay, and then all at once. James saw it happen. He did not panic, because panicking in situations that required managing was not something he had ever been good at. He moved to the counter, put his back to Owen, and was in the middle of deciding on an exit strategy when Owen's hand landed on his shoulder. "James Donovan," Owen said, not loudly, but with the complete confidence of someone who is certain. "What in the world are you doing here?" James turned. Owen was looking at him with the baffled delight of someone who has found something they weren't looking for. There were 2 other customers in the cafe, and Dot was in the kitchen, and none of this was good. "Owen," James said, keeping his voice level. "Good to see you. You're here about the Pendleton land." This worked, which was the thing about knowing enough about a person's life. You could redirect their attention with the specificity of something they actually wanted to talk about. Owen's eyes lit up, and he said, "Yes, actually." And how did James know? And what was he doing working at a cafe? "Long story," James said. "I'll tell you sometime. Are you staying overnight?" "Just the afternoon," Owen said, which was the best piece of information James had received all week. He managed the conversation through the register of 2 professional acquaintances catching up unexpectedly, kept it brief, and walked Owen to the door with the practiced warmth of someone who is ending a meeting. Owen left with the comfortable assumption that James was doing something eccentric for reasons he would understand if James ever decided to explain them, which was the useful thing about people who believed in personal eccentricity as a category. They filed unusual behavior there and moved on. But James stood in the cafe doorway for a moment after Owen's car pulled away and understood, with considerable clarity, that he had used up a piece of his available time. The world he had left was not a static thing. It moved. It traveled. It walked through doors. He had to decide before the decision was made for him. He could not decide. Not yet. This was the honest answer to a question he kept asking himself in the evenings at the harbor window, with the specific discipline of someone trying not to lie to themselves. Every time he got close to the shape of a plan, "Grace, I need to tell you something," the next thought was about her face and about the trust in it, and about what happened to that trust when it encountered the information that every honest conversation they'd ever had was technically an act of deception on his part. He told himself that the feelings were real. This was true. He told himself that the lie was in service of something genuine. This was also true, or had been at the beginning. He told himself that he would tell her soon, when the time was right. This, he understood with increasing clarity, was the thing people said when they intended to tell a truth indefinitely. December arrived, and with it the shop's busiest season. James threw himself into helping with the single-mindedness of someone who has found a problem they can control, while the problem they can't control sits in the peripheral vision and waits. He organized Grace's supplier contacts into a proper system, which she had previously been managing through a combination of memory and a notebook that had been dropped in water at some point and had never fully recovered. He found her 2 new wholesale contacts through the careful application of general business knowledge he'd always had and now had to deploy without revealing why he had it. He helped her plan a winter arrangement workshop that sold out within 3 days of being posted, which surprised Grace and did not surprise James, because he had made sure it was posted in the right places. She was grateful, and the gratitude made him feel worse, which was the appropriate feeling for someone in his situation. One evening in early December, they were closing the shop together in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have done something repeatedly enough that they don't need to narrate it, and Grace said without looking up from the register, "You're good at knowing things." "Some things," James said. "No, specifically business things. You know how supplier contracts should be structured and what marketing reach means and how to think about a customer base. You know it the way someone knows something they've been doing for a long time, not the way someone knows something they read about." She looked up. Her eyes had the quality of someone who has been thinking about something and has decided to say it. "I'm not trying to push," she said. "I know you don't talk about your past. I've respected that. But, James, whoever you were before you came here, you were good at whatever it was. James held the register pen in his hand and felt the weight of everything he hadn't said. "I made some mistakes," he said, which was true, though the mistakes he was thinking of were recent rather than historical. "And I needed to be somewhere that didn't know about them." Grace nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and he could hear in the word that she was accepting an incomplete answer while being aware it was incomplete, and that she was choosing to accept it anyway, and that this choice was costing her something. That cost, her choosing to trust him despite incomplete information, was the thing that made what he was doing feel most wrong. Not the lie itself, but the fact that it required her to make an act of faith she didn't know she was making. He made himself a promise that night, walking home along the harbor, that he would tell her before Christmas. He did not tell her before Christmas. He told her in January, and not because he had chosen the moment. It was a Saturday morning. The shop was quiet after the post-holiday lull. The window display had been changed to something minimal and white that Grace had called January honesty, and James was in the back assembling a small arrangement for a regular customer when he heard the bell above the door and then the voice. Good Lord, that's actually him. He came out from the back room and found a man standing at the counter, well-dressed and somewhat wide-eyed, with the specific expression of a person whose brain is processing something their eyes are ahead of. It was Marcus Webb, a former colleague from a company James had acquired 6 years earlier. Not someone he'd known well, but someone who had attended enough of the same meetings and events to have the face committed to memory. Marcus had been at a conference in Portland, apparently, and had taken a day trip and had walked into a flower shop to buy something for his wife. Grace was looking from Marcus to James with the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something they can't immediately categorize. "James Donovan," Marcus said again, closer to certain now. There was no version of this that James could manage. He had managed Owen by leveraging Owen's priorities and giving him something else to focus on. He could not manage Grace the same way, because Grace's priority in this moment was understanding what was happening in her own shop with the man she had been building something with for 3 months. "Grace," he said. She looked at him. Her expression was not anger yet. It was the expression before anger, when someone is still assembling information. "Who is James Donovan?" she said. Marcus appeared to realize, belatedly, that he had walked into something. He looked between them with the expression of a man who wishes he had bought flowers somewhere else. "That would be me," James said. "My real name. My actual name." Grace's hands, resting on the counter, were very still. "James Carter is not your name. James Carter is half my name. I kept the James. And Donovan,